In this book, American University professors Leonard Steinhorn and Barbara Diggs Brown look at how well integration has worked in America. By the Color of Our Skin, the illusion of integration and the reality of race argues that black and white America have not blended. The authors were invited to speak about their book in Washington, D.C. on the Martin Luther King holiday.
There we go. Okay. You all set? Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on this cold evening to join us all. My name is Jane Graff. I am the Barnes & Noble Community Relations Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to Barnes & Noble Georgetown here in our nation's capital. Martin Luther King, now 37 years ago, made a statement on the steps of the Lincoln Monument here in Washington, D.C., that he had a vision that one day his children wouldn't be known by the color of their skin, but by the characters they presented to the world. Interesting phenomenon that we're looking 36 years later, excuse me, at a book called By the Color of Our Skin, The Illusion and the Reality of Race. It takes us to a spot that we didn't exactly think we were going to be in. Most of us look at race relations in America and went, well, there's problems, but we're making progress. Well, is there such a thing as integration in the United States? Has there ever been? Or is it a myth? Our two guests this evening claim it was a myth that never existed, never had a chance to exist, and they put forth their vision of race in America and what we can do in the future. An assistant professor at American University in the School of Communications, and an associate professor at American University in the School of Community and Communications. Join us tonight to discuss their newest book, discuss race relations, and what more appropriate day to do it on than the celebration of the Martin Luther King holiday. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will join me in giving a warm Barnes & Noble welcome for Leonard Steinhorn and Barbara Diggs Brown.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to see all of you here, a lot of good friends, and I'm glad to see you here. We're here on the evening of Martin Luther King holiday to commemorate all of the great work and words of Dr. King. And I think it's fitting that our book addresses what his dream was and what the reality is today. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King had two fundamental goals for America: that America would desegregate and that America would integrate. What I want to do is begin with the good news, that in many ways, America is moving toward an increasingly desegregated society. Just look at some of the images around us. Colin Powell was considered a presidential candidate. Oprah Winfrey is in everyone's living room almost every day. There's Bill Cosby, Michael Jordan, the late Ron Brown, Bernard Shaw gives us the news and moderates presidential debates. All of these individuals, they're very visible, they're all black, and they're all signs that America has indeed loosened up a great deal on race. Our book recognizes the tremendous progress. It's progress, and remarkable progress, that a country that had virtual apartheid 30 years ago, 35 years ago, has seen legal discrimination end. That blatant racism, which was acceptable and commonplace more than a generation ago, has largely been forced underground, and people who express it are marginalized. Today, there are more than 8,000 blacks in public office through the United States. That is remarkable progress. The black middle class has seen remarkable economic mobility and educational mobility. A black population nearly illiterate half a century ago now has almost the same high school completion rate as whites. That is remarkable progress. In the Deep South, there are black police chiefs, black county commissioners, black state legislators, black mayors, black members of Congress. Imagine how unthinkable that was 35 years ago. In some communities in the United States today, their black families equal or exceed the earnings of their white neighbors. And again, think about how remarkable that is. A generation ago, a third of the working women who were black were domestics. Today, 1/10 of all the female professional workers, technical workers and managers are black. Again, that's remarkable progress. And in a very deep and profound psychological way, more than a generation ago, when a black man talked with a white woman or looked at a white woman the wrong way, it was very possible, and indeed in some parts of the country very likely, that that man could be lynched. All of this is progress. All of this is undeniable. It's all a testament to the remarkable revolution that civil rights has brought about, a revolution in desegregation. So why are we here, and why did we do this book together? Because this progress, while evidence of desegregation, does not mean that we have come close to the other goal that Dr. King articulated, the other goal of the civil rights era, integration. And that's where our story begins. Our story says that America is increasingly desegregating, but it's not integrating. That blacks and whites on a daily level intersect, but do not integrate. That integration was never even possible in the 1960s when we all thought it might be. And that we sustain the illusion that we are integrating primarily as a salve for our conscience and out of a deep desire to think that America is a nation that's better than the demons within. Now let me read from pages 5 and 6 in the book on what we mean by integration, because that's important. So what exactly is racial integration? It is about the realm of life governed by behavior and choice, not by statutes and institutions. It should not be confused with desegregation, which means the elimination of discriminatory laws and barriers to full participation in American life. Although desegregation is a necessary precondition for integration, it is entirely possible to desegregate without integrating. For blacks and whites to attend the same schools without ever learning much about each other or becoming friends. For blacks and whites to work for the same employer without mixing much on or off the job. Desegregation may unlock doors, but integration is supposed to open minds, which is why some say that integration makes desegregation look easy. Indeed, what makes racial integration so compelling is that it is about people, not laws. It is about the way we perceive each other, about the way we act toward each other, about whether there will ever be room in our hearts, homes, classrooms, and communities to welcome each other comfortably as neighbors and friends. Steeped in the pluralist tradition, integration is both colorblind and color conscious. It insists on a colorblind approach to character, ability, and personal relationships, that people be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It is built on a universal acceptance of people as individuals. Yet it appreciates and welcomes the different black and white traditions, perspectives, and historical experiences that make our nation whole. Its model could be Protestant Catholic or Jewish-Italian relations in America today, a mutual respect that acknowledges the differences and embraces the similarities. In a racially integrated America, blacks and whites would choose to live side by side, socialize with ease, see each other as peers, recommend each other for jobs, harbor little mutual distrust, respect each other's outlook, and appreciate each other's contributions to American culture. Prejudice and stereotypes might not completely disappear in an integrated society, but they would not define relationships, images, and behavior as they do today. Skin color would become incidental rather than fundamental. In a colorblind society, a middle-class white person will feel equally at home living, learning, or working in an environment 80% black or 90% white. The black majority neighborhood would perhaps feel different, but by no means threatening or disagreeable. For blacks, as one Atlanta Journal-Constitution writer put it, it means finally having the opportunity to define themselves and to calculate their lives non-racially. As architects say, are Bass fishermen a Republican? Or as former civil rights strategist Bayard Rustin used to say, we will be truly integrated when a black person can make the same mistakes as a white without anyone drawing special attention to it. Now, if you listen to the polls, as some scholars have done, you'll think that we're actually getting close to the promised land of integration, or perhaps even there. But on race, be very careful about what the polls tell us, because the polls on race relations are as much of an illusion as the possibility that we are becoming integrated. Polls tell us what we want to think about ourselves, what we want to say, not what we do, and especially when you look at those polls among whites. There are polls that say that a great majority of white people want to live in integrated neighborhoods. Reality says that integration exists only in the time between the first black family moving in and the last white family moving out. There are polls that say that some people want to have their kids attend integrated schools. In fact, in 1963, 3/4 of white Americans said that they would want their children to attend integrated schools. That's 1963. But again, the reality says otherwise. There are polls suggesting that up to 90% of whites say they have a close, personal black friend. But how is that possible when on a place like Long Island, home to about 200,000 blacks, the chance of whites encountering a black living in their neighborhood is less than 3%? How can you be friends when you don't live near each other? Indeed, if 3/4 of the whites have close black personal friends, then every black in America, including those in inner cities, would have to have about 6 close white friends. Or to put it another way, if every black had a close white friend, there would have to be 160 million blacks in America, not the 30 million blacks there are today. Boston Globe survey of Massachusetts youth found that if black and white teens were telling the truth about their interracial dating habits, each black teen in Massachusetts would have to have dated an average of 9 white people. Now, it might say something about our dreams and desires, but that certainly doesn't say much about our realities. What we've concluded is that Americans badly want to believe we've overcome, to believe that we're good and honorable people on race. That is what sustains the illusion that we are integrated. But when it comes to our personal choices, to the way we live, the way we learn, the way we love, the way we pray, the way we play, the way we follow the media, increasingly to the sports that we play, the reality of racial separation is closer to the truth. Consider the community of Madison, Illinois. It's south of Chicago. In 1980, Madison was about 12% black. In 2002, according to projections, Madison will be about 60% black. The people moving into the community, the black people moving into the community, are doctors, lawyers, accountants, bankers. The median income of Madison, Illinois, during the time period in which blacks were moving in, rose by 73%. Crime was the same as it was beforehand. School test scores were the same as they were beforehand. And home prices were going up. You would expect that this would be an ideal community for integration to take place. But whites are moving out, constantly saying that I just want a nice place to raise my kids. Now, what does it say to people who have worked hard, played by the rules, done every single thing that the United States asked of them, and white people still don't want to live around them? Of course, whites are not the only ones exercising choice. We're increasingly seeing a move among blacks toward largely black communities. Black Americans are tired of feeling angry, tired of feeling what W.E.B. Du Bois called that double consciousness of being both black and American. In an ironic way, the promise to black America of integration was that of a colorblind society. But many blacks are finding that the only time they can be in a colorblind society is when there are no whites around. Now let me offer one other point, and I'll turn it over to my co-author, Barbara. If there's any doubt that integration is not working or may never work, let's compare the situation of black Americans with other minorities. On the basis of housing patterns, on the basis of social interaction, on the basis of educational achievement, English language acquisition, small business development, and other factors commonly associated with immigration, today's immigrants are acting no differently from those immigrants who preceded them, the Jews and the Italians and the Poles and the Russians of earlier this century. The Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans of today are assimilating very similarly to the way that immigrants assimilated years ago, and they are assimilating in ways that blacks have not been able to integrate. In housing, the poorest Hispanic is less segregated than the most affluent black in America. An Hispanic or Asian with a third-grade education is more likely to live in an integrated neighborhood than a black with a PhD. Even poor immigrants are more mobile and less walled off than poor African Americans. Or look at the other commonly cited factor of integration or assimilation, intermarriage. We see in the media some high-profile cases of intermarriage, Diana Ross, Cuba Gooding Jr. But whites marry Hispanics at 7 times the rate that whites marry blacks. The black intermarriage rate is 6%. That means 6% of blacks intermarry. Of that, 4% intermarry with whites. Of native-born Hispanics, the intermarriage rate is 35%. Of native-born Asians, the intermarriage rate is 50%. And in fact, that's very similar to the patterns of intermarriage of immigrant groups. Jews are intermarrying at about 50%. Italians are up near 70%. Poles near 70%. And in fact, if you count the 6% rate of intermarriage, that may be artificially high because it's only counting marriage and not cohabitation, and blacks have lower marriage rates than other Americans. And it also includes the military, which is one of the few integrated institutions in America, which we'll get into, in which there is a much higher rate of intermarriage. In fact, if you look at military rates, it ranges between men and women, but men and women in the military are 3 or 7 times more likely to intermarry. Black men and women are 3 or 7 more times likely to intermarry than blacks who have never served in the military. And something also interesting to note, in Britain, West Indians born in Britain who are emigrated to Britain are intermarrying or cohabiting at approximately a 40% rate, about the same rate of intermarriage that you see immigrants in this country involved in. And in fact, some say that West Indians in America today are among the only immigrant groups that see their lives go downwardly mobile after a generation or two living here. So I won't go on too long because I know there'll be time for questions and Barbara's going to come up, but our point is that in America today, we intersect a lot, but we do not integrate. And to think that we are integrating, when you look at the facts and the very sad reality, is an illusion that we're propping up for our own reasons rather than for the right reality around us.
Having painted that picture in the first several chapters of the book, we do ask if racial integration has worked anywhere in America, because we would be unfair if we did not acknowledge that it has in fact done so. And so we acknowledge that in the military, and we write a little bit about the military, Corning Corporation and Shaker Heights, Ohio. In these cases, integration is working very well, but we cannot hold them up as a model to you for what America should do. Specifically because in these cases, integration is a forced situation. In the military, for instance, promotions, in fact, punishments, often come as a result of whether or not integration is working within a unit. In the military, men and women must be ready to do battle. They are required to work with one another. It is a requirement that they must observe in the military in order to be successful there. In Shaker Heights, and I'm going to turn to the book to read a paragraph to you, what is true in Shaker Heights is also true in other rare instances of integration in America. Real integration depends on social engineering. Constant vigilance, government authority, official attention to racial behavior, and willingness by citizens to relinquish at least some personal choice for the greater good. And so we arrive at a fundamental dilemma of racial integration in America. The same factors that appear essential to successful integration run directly counter to some of our deepest beliefs about self-determination, authority, and individual rights. More than 2 centuries ago, our nation was founded on a suspicion of vested power and an affirmation of individual liberty. It is that individual liberty that makes us Americans. Those are the things that we say we want to be able to do. In Shaker Heights, it is not possible to go in and decide where you would like to buy a home and in what community. You must first work with the housing authority, and you must then decide where you will be able to live in that community. Again, limiting the choice of Americans in order to have racial integration. The Corning Corporation, which moved to Corning, New York, found that the attrition rate for black employees was growing. And what was happening was that black employees were coming to work for Corning and leaving as quickly as they would come. And so Corning decided they wanted to do something about the situation, and in fact began to make racial integration within that corporation a factor for every executive there. And so that in order to get promotions, in order to move up in Corning, you had to be prepared to make sure that racial integration, that hiring black people was a part of your planning for your particular department. And so in that case, we have Corning. Again, racial integration working within a corporation. But again, because free choice is something that we've become accustomed to as Americans, we are not comfortable with situations like Shaker Heights. Some of us with places like Corning Corporation. The last chapter of our book asks if in fact we are in such a situation in America, if we are living parallel lives, white families and black families, living parallel lives in different communities, separated where we work and where we play and where we pray, then what do Lenny Steinhorn and Barbara Diggs Brown have in mind for America? Well, the first thing we suggest is radical racial honesty. We think it's critical that we admit to ourselves that the illusion of integration is something that we use to make ourselves feel better. And that, in fact, because we are not racially integrated, that we begin to do some of the things that we could do to make ourselves more comfortable, take some of the pressure off of us for feeling that we must feel integrated. And so we recommend three things in the course of our book. One of them, and the one that I think we're both most excited about, is the idea of using advertising and marketing to bring into our living rooms, through the ubiquitous television that we all watch, messages about one another that might help us understand where we are in America. We looked at how much money is spent in advertising on an annual basis by most of the advertisers in this country, and we said if only a small portion of that money could be used to bring messages that would make us more, not necessarily racially integrated, but racially aware of one another. We looked at numbers like $100 million to promote chunkier, thicker toppings for Pizza Hut pizzas, $300 million for Reebok, and the other shoe manufacturer won't come, Nike. $300 million in advertising to convince us that we need shoes that we don't need and send us out to buy them. If some of that money could be used to bring us the messages that would make a difference in our lives socially, then we think the money would have been well used. There are two other suggestions. One is that we do something about the concept of minority in this country, that we begin to use the word differently than we use it now, because we do not feel that minority actually describes the status of African Americans in America. The other is that we be honest about affirmative action, and I don't want this to turn into an affirmative action discussion because that's something we don't do a great deal of in the book, but that if we are honest, both opponents and proponents of affirmative action, if we admit, as Dr. King said, that there must be some reverse discrimination in this country, that would be the proponents, if we were honest about it. And if the opponents of affirmative action would admit as well that something must be done in this country, then we in fact might get a little closer to the truth. And racial reality might not be as stark as it is for us right now. So, not going to talk any longer. Lenny? Yeah, sure.
Just figured we'd read, since it is Dr. King's birthday, we would read from our postscript. So we'll each take a paragraph, and Barbara, you can lead on.
This book has brought us on an intellectual journey to a destination quite different from where we wanted to go. Integration is an ideal both of us would prefer to see realized in our lifetimes. A truly colorblind, integrated America is a vision we share. We believe it is the best interest of all Americans, black and white. Part of us wants to buy into the integration illusion, to praise the emperor's clothes, to embrace the hope of the dreamers that yes, it can work. We want a happy ending, but try as we might, the facts simply fail to accommodate our desires, and the racial reality stubbornly refuses to change. We must conclude, regrettably, that integration is an illusion born of hope and desire, and that our very devotion to the ideal ironically helps us avoid a real reckoning on race, and that for our nation, to move beyond today's racial endgame, we must relinquish the hope of ever reaching the racial promised land. In writing this book, we faced the choice of telling the truth. We did not want to tell. In writing this book, we faced the choice of telling a truth we did not want to tell, or of perpetuating a fiction that we wanted to believe. There wasn't much of a choice.
It is wrenching to reach this conclusion. We may be scholars, but we have dreams too. As troubling as our findings may be, deep down we have always hoped that this book would serve as a challenge to America, a spur to wake us from our deep denial and move us toward a truly colorblind nation. Our research tells us such an awakening is at best remote and unlikely, at worst impossible and beyond hope. Yet hope we will. Quote, "Yes, I am personally the victim of deferred dreams, of blasted hopes," said Martin Luther King in his 1967 Christmas Eve sermon. But in spite of that, I close today by saying I still have a dream because, you know, you can't give up in life. If you lose hope, somehow you lose that vitality that keeps life moving. You lose that courage to be, that quality that helps you go on in spite of all. May our hearts somehow, in some way, prove our heads wrong. Thanks. So we would love to take questions and any and all comments. Mrs. Scott.
I'm sure you both saw that article in the New York Times a couple weeks ago regarding TV viewing preferences along racial lines and the vast disparity, which seemed to be right along the lines of what you're discussing. Given those, and given your desire to use marketing as a means to reach out across races, do you see the increasing fragmentation of the media and television especially as an opportunity or as a danger? And how do you think it's best addressed?
That's a good question. In fact, we use similar statistics in the book in Chapter 3 and discuss that. There are some who say, for example, that among young people, that young people are breaking down the barriers and there's more crossing interracially. But when you actually look at when two shows that appeal to youth went up against each other, Living Single on Fox and Friends on NBC, white viewership of Friends was high, black viewership of Friends was low. Black viewership of Living Single was high, white viewership of Living Single was low. So you do see this fragmentation. But I think that's all the more reason why we need to do what we have to do. And these messages cannot be harmony on a hillside, I like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony type of thing. They have to be tough. They have to address the stereotypes. We describe in the book a case that's very poignant and should be hit to the heart of almost anyone. You're in an upper middle class neighborhood, predominantly white, and you're a black homeowner, and you want to sell your home. You are advised by the real estate agent to hide every element of your identity in a box because white people might not buy a house that blacks had lived in or owned. So you walk into a house and you see in that house that there are no pictures, no diplomas, no artwork. Many of the records aren't even there. And you can tell that some of them have been put away because the dust is still on the credenza, right? And then you go down to the laundry room and you see in the box people's whole lives and identities. Now, why is it that somebody would not want to buy that house in what is largely a stable, economically viable, non-changing community where there's no threat to home values or anything else? What is it? These are the types of issues we should be addressing in the media like that. So because we're fragmenting, there's a greater imperative to do this, a much greater imperative.
Yes.
In part of the book, you say that your purpose is to examine integration and segregation rather than to prescribe remedies. But in this presentation, you seem to be adopting a more nihilist position and striking down the examples in the book of success in stable integration in Corning and Shaker Heights in the military.
Well, we felt... Oh, I'm sorry.
My question is, why do you, in this presentation, spend such time striking down the few examples of success that you found in your research? Looking at the reasons that you gave for not advocating the kind of things that have been done in these circumstances, are that they limit choices. But, for example, Jeffrey Hennig, in his work on school choice, points out that stable integration often involves practices that increase the choices of blacks but decrease the choices of whites. Have you given any thought to how your work is going to be spun and used in the policy debate about things like school choice?
Well, first, we're realist in terms of work being spun and used, and we use Dr. King as a perfect example. And if you can spin that message and use it, and many conservatives do, then we have no doubt that'll happen. However, in looking at Shaker Heights, we felt, first of all, as scholars, that we could not say there is no racial integration in America, that it is a myth, without exploring the three obvious examples where racial integration is working. So that was necessary, we thought. Secondly, in the case of Shaker Heights, we believe that Shaker Heights may, well, we postulate that Shaker Heights may be as successful as it is because they started such a long time ago working on this. Some of the people we interviewed there, one of the gentlemen we interviewed there who is a realtor, an African-American gentleman, has been there since 1952. So this work began a long time ago. So the idea is not to, and we hope we have not, been two-faced in our presentation. We did want to present most of the book to you, and that's the effort that we were making, to take you all the way through the book.
And we were not trying to blast away those possibilities. What we're suggesting is that integration can work if people are willing to make the sacrifices and do the hard work and give up some of the choices in America. But we contrast that with an American culture which for 2 centuries has been very hesitant to do any form of social engineering, to give up choices. When choices in America are threatened, people scream. So ours is less a prescriptive analysis than an analysis of what we believe the reality would be. We certainly hope it would be different. But you look in the Washington, D.C. area where there are affluent black communities around that would be perfectly hospitable for any white family, and you see white people not going there. How can you change that? Can you social engineer that type of change? We don't see that as possible, but by all means, we are open to suggestions otherwise.
And we refer to integration, one last point, we refer to it as an ideal. And as Americans, we believe in those ideals. We interviewed one gentleman who said, okay, let's admit then, perhaps, that integration is a myth. What are you going to replace that myth with? If you are willing to take it away, then what myth are you going to give us back? Because as Americans, we need those ideals. We need those myths to push us forward.
This is the truth about America. We believe we're different in America. We believe we can accomplish anything and change anything. And I think part of the integration myth reflects that desire to think that we can do some things that other countries may not be able to do. It may not be so bad to say that, hey, if we can be like a Switzerland or a Belgium. In Belgium, the Flemish and the French coexist, they intersect, they go their separate ways, but equality and social justice are part of the social contract there. If we can get to that state, hey, that's progress. But let's not have the illusion that, we're going to get to the state of all of us holding hands and being best buddies, when in fact that seems unlikely. The other stuff is doable and possible.
In the back, yes.
Well, you seem to discuss the condition and the remedy. Do you grapple with the question of why? Why do whites and blacks don't see it? Is it a heritage of racism, social culture differences, or is it just degrades of pigmentation of skin? Why?
I'll start, and we do this pretty well, I think. I think it's necessary, we think it's necessary to look at our history in this country. We are a country that had to create a reason why it was all right to enslave another group of people. Because we had this wonderful ideal of democracy, We had this wonderful idea of every single man being born equal. And yet we had to be able to enslave a group of people and say for some reason they were not quite eligible for those rights. And so we began that acculturation in this country. And it is something that I don't think has gone and I don't think will go anytime soon.
We try to drill down pretty deep on this question, and one of our chapters deals explicitly with us with that, as well as a couple of others. But let's look at the case of the box where black family put themselves in when they try to sell their home. The common thing today is, well, the reason why whites are terrified of blacks is because of crime and affirmative action. Well, crime certainly can't explain why a white family might not buy that house, okay? Affirmative action certainly can't explain that. And granted, there are issues with crime and there are issues with affirmative action, but when you go down to that personal level, those don't relate. So where do we go with that? One of the more troubling things that we came up with in our research was we were combing through the Newsweek magazines of the 1960s. And in 1963, found a survey in which 71%, I think it was, of white Americans said that blacks smell different, okay? The year after, about 2/3 of white Americans continued to say that. As soon as it became socially unacceptable to say those things, that finding dropped to virtually zero, okay? But the question is, not the issue of smell, but the issue that Barbara addresses of dehumanization to justify the contradiction in our society. How much is that dehumanization taking place? I challenge almost any white person in America to say they have never heard of a black person referred to as a jungle bunny, a monkey, an ape, or a gorilla. How far is that process of dehumanization taking place, and how much does that still stick with us? Each of us, okay? None of us, myself included, exempt from this, okay? We ask that question. We don't have answers, but we feel it's appropriate to ask. Another way to look at it, a little more sociologically, is that America is a very status-oriented society, very status-oriented. And most Americans, every American, does not want to be associated with the people behind them, okay? Dick Gregory used to joke that the first word that immigrants used to learn coming off the boat how to spell was N-I-G-G-E-R, okay? The idea was that if you could be ahead of somebody in society, that's great. So perhaps the person who doesn't want to buy that house doesn't want to be associated with a house that is seen as less in status than another house because of its association with African Americans. So those are the issues we probe. There's really no way, to sort of put the United States on the couch and psychoanalyze it like that. And even then, I'm sure we wouldn't find everything. But we're trying to at least be honest about it. And that's the point of the radical racial honesty, is that we be honest about those reasons, start dealing with them, and start addressing them.
And sometimes if we are willing to admit something to ourselves, we may not have to necessarily go out and confess and admit it to everyone else. But we do know the jokes we hear. We do know the things that we hear when the doors are closed. We do know what goes on around the kitchen table at home. And we have to admit that we might be some small part, if only because we hear and don't respond.
And let me just follow that with one other thing. It's not all, white. It's a lot of anger among blacks, a lot of anger among blacks today that I don't personally think that the black community is completely owned up to, okay? And that anger it comes from a number of sources. It comes from just exhaustion with dealing with the issue of integration. Exhaustion of wondering whether you can put a piece of African art up in your office or sit with a colleague, a black colleague, at lunch and not be seen as some sort of isolationist or segregationist. It's that anger that you're seeing that's moving the black community towards saying, let's get away from those folks, I don't want to deal with this stuff anymore. But white people then pick up on that anger, which then moves white people even further away because they feel that anger and they don't want to have to be hit with it like a gale force wind, okay? So it's a process that's sucking us all in.
All kitchen tables, not just white ones. Didn't mean to imply so. Yes?
I understand what you're saying about people talking together and being honest about stuff, but how do you feel about parts of this country, which I guess one would be 10 blocks down the road, Virginia, where they're celebrating Lee Jackson Day today? And all you can say about people You know, people want to feel like they're good. Well, what about when people don't? What about when people are celebrating Confederate war heroes, and they're celebrating it without flinching, without feeling bad about it? You know, and I feel like, you know, someone maybe growing up in an area where maybe people do want to talk about things and people do want to feel, you know, that they somehow aren't wronging anybody else. But it seems like so much of our country, and with just like the people who are our leaders in our Congress right now, so many people in our country, they don't care about those things. And what do we do? What do we do there?
Tough one.
Well, go ahead, why don't you?
You start.
Well, I mean, that's a very tough one. You know, people obviously can think what they wish, and that's one of the wonders of a free society. Let's think about it in another society. Let's say you're a child growing up in Germany in and around World War II. Your parents or grandparents are on a farm or in a small community, and what do you remember? You remember the hardship. You remember the misery. You don't remember the concentration camps. You don't remember the people being put in ovens. You remember the hardship and the misery. That is your and your family's experience with history. That does not make that person anti-Semitic by no means, okay? White people in the South, from their perspective, handed down through their history, had a certain perspective. That does not make all of them who have that history in their family thriving racists, okay? It's the people who want to deny the validity of Martin Luther King. That's where I begin to worry, okay? But in a public dialogue, that doesn't happen as much anymore because everyone wants to give a certain amount of dignity to King, even those who allegedly oppose him. But yeah, you've got to worry about the Trent Lotts and the White Citizens Councils and all the rest of that stuff. I mean, that's certainly a current of what's going on. What worries me more are not those folks who are at the margin, but it's all of us in the middle. The people in Madison, Illinois, who just want a nice place to raise their kid, and yet they will be perfectly happy when their 99% white school celebrates Martin Luther King's holiday with a reading from King's I Have a Dream speech. That's where the honesty has to come from. The other folks, let them do their thing if that's the case. We ain't going to stop them.
Fatigue. There's a lot of fatigue in America, and it's impossible to address it all. And as Lenny says, it's for those of us who are in denial, who would be good citizens, who would be work hard, play by the game, and the rest of it, who don't equate the two when it comes to a white person and a black person. Yes, sir.
I'd like to take a deep breath. I'd like to offer criticism. Essentially, you've talked about 4 topics that I, in my mind, have reduced it to. Desegregation. Louder, please. Desegregation, integration, and racial mixing. The 4th topic is American citizenship. And my criticism is that a 180-degree view of what you have presented is more emphatic and more important. The focus upon the American citizenship concept, not the differences between the races, not the disparities between the classes, not the differences between the ethnicities, but the focus on what constitutes the dignity of a human being. Second, when we talk about recognizing and having tolerances for other person's ways of life, does not necessarily mean someone wishes to adopt those. It means they are willing to cohabitate and exist with. And that's something very important because people do not want to lose their own identities, whatever they are, whether they're black, whether they're white, whether they're Irish, whether they're whatever. So my position that I'm suggesting to you is that instead of covering Shaker Heights, that you shake the heights, that you are in the academic community, and you ought to be talking to your own peers, and you ought to be telling them, look, folks, America and Americanism is not working. You want to see racial upset and concern, all you have to do is go to any American city in the United States and interview anybody there, and you'll hear it. It's not working, and something has to be done about it. This approach, which says the idea of bringing people together on an economic, social basis, is bringing the races at conflict, rather than focusing on the point of what Americanism is, and that is the equal opportunity. That is the acceptance for your character. That is the acceptance for what contribution you're making to the way of life. That is for your cultural endowments that you're rewarding the community with. That's what needs to be shaken in the Heights. I attended the University of Oregon many years ago when Arthur S. Fleming was the president out there. He had been the former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. By the way, his wife just recently passed away. She's quite an interesting gal in her own right. At the University of Oregon, they almost ran Arthur M. S. Fleming out of Oregon, because when he came there, he was on the campuses in 1968 to encourage that there be integration, that there be a desegregation, because that was what the court had declared, not integration. The court had declared desegregation, and making every effort to open the doors of the colleges, bring anybody in, lower the standards of the institution in every way possible, because people who couldn't read, write, and do arithmetic, how would they get into the institution to begin with? They were parceled out. They had no way, no opportunity. That's what I'm addressing you to as, because you're professors, and you know that has not ever disappeared from the United States. Right here in Washington, D.C., it's pathetic.
Let me just address your issue of citizenship, and I think both of us would agree that that it's how we judge each other as people is the single and most important thing, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. But let me give you an example of one of the institutions in which people are addressing each other as equals, the military, as Barbara discussed, where we have seen remarkable progress in integration. Yet, retired black generals who have had responsibility for thousands of soldiers, I read from page 233, retired black generals who have had responsibility for thousands of soldiers and complex military systems rarely find jobs in the outside world commensurate with their rank and abilities. And we quote from the two experts in the field, Charles Moskos and Butler. It is difficult not to conclude that the discrimination these people overcame in the military overtakes them again when they return to civilian life. So yes, in theory, I agree with you. But realistically, what do we say to those generals? Can we have another question, please? Yes?
I'm an educator, and I also do diversity training, and two of the more complex problems that I'm coming up with is the answer to the question for my white students or white participants, what makes it worth it? You know, what do I get out of this? If you're comfortable, if you're a fish in the water, why do I want to come out and see what you see? And the other is putting the responsibility on the majority culture to make the change. Those seem to be two very difficult things to do. The responsibility is not the victim to try to create some vision on the part of those who are participating in the oppression. But it's very hard to have someone who's comfortable, someone who has the illusion that things are working, to say, why move, why change?
You know, it strikes me that the people who are, who proclaim the greatest about patriotism in this country, who say, I love my country more than anything else, don't think about this issue all the time, every day, okay? Because no other issue is at the center of our culture and civilization. So, you know, in terms of race relations, unfortunately, as you point out, blacks have largely been doing the relating. And that is unfortunate. I would agree with you. I think that more has to be done, but how can you do it when people don't even want to sit in the same classroom or live in the same neighborhood?
And in the work that you do, the work you do is difficult work, because you come into a room where a group of people, 15 or 20 people, have been told by their supervisors or the new president of the company, Peter Bourgeois, that things are going to change here, like it or not. So I am telling you what the environment is going to be in this particular corporation, and it is completely up to you to become enlightened. Now, that's not fun. Nobody wants to go to work and be told things are not only changing, but whether or not you're comfortable with it makes not a hill of beans. But the bottom line is, in corporate America today, if you pick up a paycheck, you do things the way you're told to do them. So what you did with index cards 3 decades ago, you do with computers today. You may not have gone happily, but you went there. And so that's difficult work. I have a great appreciation for what it is you do. But
In our section on the workplace, to follow up on Barbara's point, we say that in many ways white workers deal with blacks as, quote, a problem to be dealt with, okay? Not necessarily as people, co-workers, part of the team, but a problem to be dealt with, to be managed, because, my gosh, there's all this paperwork, and if I don't do this, then I'm going to be yelled at by somebody else or whatever, so I'm going to manage the problem. And so what often happens in a very sad situation is that we end up with white companies putting blacks in very high-profile positions like community relations positions, but not in positions of decision-making and product development, okay? Because the white company wants to manage the problem by saying, you see, aren't we pretty good? Look at all we've done. Barbara mentions Texaco. Right about the time that Texaco had that lawsuit against it, they were putting out brochures in which there were 9 people on the cover, all smiling and happy, working together. 3 of them were black, and aren't we a happy family, okay? And in fact, it's not just the companies that are doing it, the media. We didn't talk much about that, but we call this the phenomenon of virtual integration, in which white people, every night in their living rooms, watch television and see black faces on television, whether it's a news anchor or somebody in a sitcom or an ER or people on commercials. They see it all the time, okay? So you have the idea that the world is integrated from who's in your living room, okay? So maybe it's not such a big deal if I walk out my door and the only faces I happen to see going to work the next day are white. We call that virtual integration. So in many ways, we are dealing on the level of symbolism. We have to get beyond that.
We've come to the point where most professors don't like to come. It's time to get across campus and get to another class, except we're told one more question is possible. So if there is one more, we would love to have it. Yes?
I just wanted to ask a question about the military, because I didn't see, in my experience as a person who's in the military, I didn't see it as a integrated model. I saw it more as intersection, as you described, because in the evening, once the military work was over, blacks went to the black club, whites went to the white club. So I don't know if that was a good model.
Well, it certainly, the book also looks at the phenomenon that you are describing about the military. We give the military its due because scholars have, in fact, spent a great deal of time looking at it as a model and where it works. And in many cases, what we can give in terms of kudos to the military is that there are people getting promotions, there are people moving through that system who were not in the past. That is not, that begins to look at progress in shades. And we are not happy with all of the shades that we see, but it is progress nonetheless.
But you do see, if the military is just intersecting, then what does that say about the rest of our society? Because the intermarriage rates, for example, are much higher. When you look at the most integrated neighborhoods in America, most of them are around military bases, okay? So you're seeing that the spillover from at least a culture where this is attempted or put places of value, or where it's somewhat enforced, that there's a spillover residentially and in terms of people's personal lives. So you are seeing that. I'll make one final comment about Dr. King, since it is his birthday today. One of the things we looked at was how Dr. King has been turned into sort of a bumper sticker caricature, okay? I don't think there is a single person who cannot remember the words of not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And indeed, you turn on the radio and TV today, that's what you hear. It's become the mantra of our society, and we all hope that that becomes the reality, okay? But let's also look at the other things that Dr. King talked about, because he talked about the hard work. He talked about the sacrifice. He talked about the fact that some people may not feel fully comfortable with the solutions that have to be made to make this an integrated society, but we have to do it if we're going to be there. So let's not turn Dr. King into the caricature that he worked his entire life to avoid becoming. Let's take him seriously, and on this, his holiday, his birthday holiday, that is a plea that we give to all America.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, James.
Thanks very much.
Thanks to Professor Diggs Brown and Professor Steinhorn. We're going to leave them up here at the front tables. Please please feel free to come up the center aisle, get your books autographed, talk to them one-on-one. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. We hope you come back and join us again. Excuse me, please.
Can we grab one of these? Is that how it works?
There's plenty on the table, too. Why don't you folks have a seat? It'll be much, I think it'll be simpler for you.
Something has to take them out in order to exactly. And for some, it isn't. It's the children that get.
Yeah, that's what my mom says. We'll pray for that. Hi. Thanks for the question. It's a good question. It's hard.
Is your mic on the podium?
Especially when you're
If I move that podium, it won't scream in you.
Oh, are you? You're native, yeah. That happens. That happens a lot. Oh, Melanie.
This is tremendous. I'm so happy for you both. That really
Thank you.
My question was,
Well, I want to put Barbara. I want to say our.
Sure.
You mind?
No, of course not.
That's
That was
important.
wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Yes. And how about that class? You got your syllabus ready?
Tomorrow night, I'm all set.
Really? You got first? Oh, I don't have to teach till Thursday.
Lucky you.
Well, yeah, considering how long I've been talking all day long. We started talking on Fox Morning News this morning.
Even
Been
as
talking
we
ever
try to
since.
step out and look at it. What are the hopes? I
Thank
mean,
you.
in here are, we
picture.
basically say the hopes are not great, so we have to be realistic about where to go.
I do want to have a chance to think about my colleagues' inscription, though. I need to do it fast.
Somebody pulled a
Do you
plug out
mind
from
if we do
under
it at school?
Rain made
Yeah,
motions
I'd like,
because
you
of
know,
visualization.
I'd like to be able to think
And my
and not.
reporting, the Emperor has it close as should be.
Barnes and Noble did a wonderful job. They, the District Weekly did an ad. They did an ad in the District Weekly on Thursday, and sent out a huge.
I know.
They did a good job.
So how did Fox go?
Fox was wonderful. In fact, I mean, I haven't seen it and don't want to see it. I'll just pretend I didn't do that, but I think it went very well. People called from all over the city. Saw you on television this morning. Yeah, so that was nice. And then I had the pro here. He does Fox all the time. I told John we'd like to do this at school. Give us a chance to think about it.
Okay, I'll let you guys go.
John Pence. Thanks for coming. It was nice. How's yours? Glad you're here.
Hi. Having a good break?
Yes.
We'll have you in class pretty soon, however.
Just got your book. There's only one book.
Only one?
That's all we saw.
Oh, you should have seen any. Did you have, what book did you have for PC writing? I didn't order a book because I'm going to let you use your writing book, so take it back. Tell them your professor said you didn't order a book.
Well, the bookstore's not quite so understated. We can see.
Oh, no,
I tried to
they
get my book
will.
for strategic communication with Dr. Sutton. They said
Not
there is
there.
no class. She told me, I went home panicked, called Dr. Sutton. She said, no, she's not teaching that class. I said, what do you mean? It's tomorrow night.
What? Okay, we have to get all of that straight. Nothing like doing administration at Barnes and Noble. But you had a text for writing, right? I will call the
We had the
library.
text that you had, because we were in the class that then got switched to.
Okay, that's all we need. We don't need it. And I will call them and tell them they should accept it. Without any problem.
Okay.
No, I don't know.
Okay, well, if you don't know, then I can help.
Okay.
I'm in charge of dating, so if I forget,
You have the easy part.
please let me know.
See you on Thursday.
Okay, thanks. Students, captain, you know.
Yeah.
They get an extra half-point grade.
Of course. I intend to give 50 points on Thursday morning.
Extra credit.
Yes.
So should I subscribe to TED or?
Yeah, went to me. Susan had a baby boy yesterday.
Oh, she did. Wow.
I'm supposed to pass that on to the professors.
Well, congratulations.
Baby boy.
She's got a good
Thanks so much.
excuse. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. We need it.
That's why I took it.
Parched.
I can't believe you're not taking the class. It's like misrepresentation.
Yeah.
You need some water, you could.
I think it's gonna last. We have a radio. Yeah.
Where are you guys heading next?
Home to answer the telephone for what we hope is a more calm version of the talk show we did earlier today.
What was that?
Oh, it was just no, it was just a fun radio show. It was fine.
Okay.
Nice feisty questions.
I just hate it when the questions are, can you solve the economic problems in Detroit? No, you cannot.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the presentation.
Ah, good.
I was in like a taste of school. Academics, back
All ready to get there.
back in my vein.
That's good. You like it? You enjoying?
I'm not in school now. I miss it. So this is, you know, a little bit. I don't miss it now.
No, but
I miss it enough to come and listen and then go home. Tad is my boss. He couldn't come. He's out of town.
How are you?
he's a love. Tell him hi and thank you, and I miss seeing him and talking to him.
I don't think he realized I wasn't coming because last week I said, "Oh, I got the invitation. Are you going?" He said, "Yeah, you're going, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, great." And then he got on a plane today. I was like, "Hey."
Well,
So
tell him hi.
he's teaching again this semester, so he'll be around. Yeah, you'll see him. Thanks.
See ya. Thank you.
There's a display at the end of the cash register.
Brent, good to see you. Really, thanks for coming. How's your house?
By the Color of Our Skin is published by Dutton, a division of Penguin Putnam. To learn more about the book, click on their website at penguinputnam.com.